Okay, so that's the break. Let's get back to our discussion, how to structure a persuasive message. Um, so when you look at communication or think about communication, it is actually a quite important social process. Right? Social meaning that you cannot just think about yourself. You have to think about the other person. What are their interests? What are their concerns? And what are the things that they are acceptable or they are against, right? So this means that you need or you have to capture the interest of your audience in order to make your message effective, let alone persuasive, right? And if your audience are bored or confused, you are wasting your time. So that means you need to present your message in a way that the audience can understand and relate to, right? So the choice of topic, of course, is important. You need to choose a topic that the audience is interested in, but after you have chosen the topic, the way of presenting the topic is also a matter, right? It could also greatly influence how acceptable your audience are towards your message. Um, so here we will introduce the so-called narrative structure of your message. Narrative refers to the series of events that occur in the search for the solution of a problem, right? So here, as later we will see, the narrative structure, would have this sequence of presenting a problem and then solving the problem, right? So it has this narrative structure has to have this problem solution dynamic, right? And this dynamic underpins everything from arguments and reason in the scientific method, right? Almost everything we do is about identifying a topic, introducing a problem, then finding a solution. Okay, so that is the essence of APT structure, right? Or say the narrative structure. So the best way to structure your message is to use this narrative structure or the so-called APT structure. Right? So here is how we use the APT structure and what it is. So you want to frame your message using the APT structure, which information you want the audience to focus on. Right? So what information to include and how to assemble it to get the attention of the audience. So here, that means the core of the structure of your message should be a problem and then a solution because no one wants to buy a solution without a problem. That means problem should be the core of the message. And after the problem, you can present a solution, right, to make the message more relevant. So here is a famous story consultant, is McKee. He said a great story creates a meaningful emotional experience for the audience through the use of conflict and resolution. So conflict and resolution, so that is again another way of saying you have a problem and then you solve the problem, right? So this narrative structure, or say the ABD structure of the message, borrows the general structure of Hollywood screens writers, right? And also the Hollywood screenwriter actually borrowed the structure of the so-called the hero's journey. So if you know something about mythology, there's a famous researcher called Joseph Campbell. He actually surveyed all the great mythologies across all the cultures. And he actually found a common structure of all those mythologies. So basically, he summarized the structure of those stories, those mythologies, as the hero's journey. So the hero's journey can be briefly summarized as three acts or three phases. At the first phase, the hero lived in the normal world, in nothing special, everything's ordinary. And then something occurs that generates a problem, right? Now it's in the so-called special world. In the special world, there is a conflict that you have to solve. And then the hero would try to use all his skills, all his wisdom to solve this problem. And then after the problem is solved, the hero again get back to the ordinary world, right? To the common world, then everything is in harmony with each other. But of course, the state of the hero, the mindset of the hero is different than before because now the hero, after experiencing these difficulties and solving the problem, he is a different man. He has a deeper wisdom or he has different mindset, right? So if you look at all the great stories, all the great movies, it follow this structure. And some hero, is commonly lived in the world ordinary, and then some issue happens, making that disturbs the harmony of the world, and this main character has to try his best to solve this issue. And after the issue is solved, it's back to normal. But now the hero would get the main character would have a changed view, right? So what we can do is just to borrow this common structure to structure the common storyline, the hero's journey, to structure our message to make our message more persuasive, right? So here is the essence of a persuasive message. So basically, we just borrow this hero's journey, the general structure of great movies, great mythologies. You need to identify a problem and offer a solution. So that should be the core of your message. So all the important persuasive message should have a problem. And then you should offer a solution. If there's not any problem, I mean, that's not a message, an important message for people to listen to, right? So you need to identify the problem. So the problem would excite the brain as the arousal. It build interest and gain attention. While on the other hand, the solution would quiet the mind as fulfillment. It also at the same time motivate action and motivate the change of the views or opinions. Uh, Although problem is the core, and after the problem, you should offer the solution. But before presenting the problem, you should also need to first build an agreement in order to reduce resistance. Okay? According to our discussion of cognitive dissonance, confirmation bias, you should talk about something that the audience should accept with any problem to build this agreement. So to summarize this three part, we will conclude with the so-called ABT narrative structure of a persuasive message. So basically, if you look at most of the persuasive message, be it presidential candidate's speech, be it some of the pop songs, be it some important scientific papers that presenting important discovery, they all follow this ABT structure. Now, I can give you a formal definition of the ABT structure, why we call it ABT structure. So here, ABT represent and, but, therefore, respectively, right? So the persuasive message should start with the so-called and would present the context that everyone could agree with, the audience could agree with. After presenting the context, you are ready to present the problem. As we said, the problem would excite the mind and build interest, right? So the audience would realize that there's a problem and they will focus on your message. And after presenting the message, you can offer the solution, right? So ABD structure has been proven to be most effective, and this structure can be compared with some other structures. I mean, when you ask some children to tell a story, you will see that their story are usually boring because by the words they use, you can see it's nothing fancy that you want to pay attention to. Sometimes my daughter tell me a story, and you see that today I did this, and then I did that, and then and. So that is the so-called and AAA structure. This AAA structure is boring because by following the message, you don't know which part you should pay attention to. And when you everything is and that means, I mean, nothing special in this storytelling, right? So you are not focused on some problems So you will get bored without noticing anything important in this story. On the other hand, if you look at some of the academic papers, it's very difficult to understand because their logics are just too convoluted, right? So sometimes they use the so-called despite, however, yet structure, right? So they say despite this occurs, we did this, however, there's another thing that we don't do, yet the third thing is there. So the logic is just too convoluted because again, when we have this different turning point, a lot of turning point, you will not be able to focus on any single one. So people again don't know where to focus on, right? In comparison, the APT structure, you set the context, and then there's a problem. The problem is the core. You know where to pay attention. And then because your attention is aroused, you are ready to listen to the solution. So that's how the APT structure would work to make your message most effective, right? Again, here is a simple illustration of the ABD structure. I mean, following the standard structure of the hero's journey, you have the start. You first start with the ordinary world. That's the end part. You set the context. And then the problem arises, right? After the problem arises, you are in the special world. I mean, this is the so-called narrative world, and there's a problem that you have to solve. That's the conflict. That's where your interest, the audience interest, get aroused, and then they are ready to keep listening to see what you are trying to do to offer a solution. Right. So then they are ready for solution. You offer the solution. The problem is solved. You are back to the ordinary world. So that's the ABT structure. Right. So the three acts play that you commonly observed in the Hollywood screen scripts. Right? So here, if you check this, we have the context that is the A part, right? It's build agreement, is fall into the ordinary world, and then you present a problem that's present a contradiction. Then we get into the realm of special world, and then the solution part offered by zero, the T part, the zero four part is present the consequences, and then you are back to ordinary world. Right? So let's just look at this three-part A, B, T one by one to see how we can construct each part. And then you get the general idea to structure your message. The A part, the end part, it should set the context. Right? Again, this falls into the ordinary world. You try to describe the ordinary world. You try to lay the groundwork. Right? What you should do is to lay out these plain and simple facts that everyone can agree on. Right? In order, I mean, this A part, the context should depends on your target audience, right? So if you, again, as a psychologist, you're talking to other psychologists. I mean, you could set more specific context. But if you're talking to a general public, then this context should be broader, right? So what you are trying to do is to point out this is our current state that most of your audience should agree upon. And then you could further illustrate what is at the stake in the ordinary world, right? In order to emphasize the stake, you could use if-then structure, right? So after presenting some current state, right, you say that if we do this, then good things can happen. If we don't do this, then terrible things can happen. So this if-then for highlighting the stake is an optional part. You don't have to have it, but sometimes having it would make this context to be more acceptable to the audience. So let me give you one example, right? So here is one ABD structure that presenting the importance of one piece of research, right? So here is something related to neuroscience, right? You don't have to know the neuroscience. Let's just try to understand the structure, focusing on the structure and focusing on the main information, main message is trying to convey. So the neurons is the neural cells in our brain. The neurons involved in opioid production are located in one part of the brain and are involved in both pain and pleasure. right? So this is some context, right? You can see that this is talking to scientists. It's not probably not to the general public. But here the problem comes. We don't know which neurons are involved in which, right? The problem is there. Therefore, I try to figure this out for individual neurons. So this highlights the problem that you are trying to solve, highlight the importance of the research that you are trying to do. However, it seems that the stake is not that high, even though there's a problem. But why this is a great problem, right? In order to highlight the stake, to make people realizing how important or how serious the problem is, you could use this if-then structure to highlight the stake, right? Well, here, after setting the context, you can say that if we can figure out which individual neurons are involved in pleasure and distinguish them from the neurons involved with pain, then we can work on mechanism to activate only the pain relieving neurons, which could bypass the pleasure part of the effect and thus reduce addiction. All right. So here, after you're setting the background, and then you emphasize the stake, even though we know the fact some neurons are in charge of, these neurons are in charge of both pain and pleasure. But if we are able to distinguish which are in charge of pain, which are in charge of pleasure, then we can solve this big problem of addiction, right? Now, after emphasizing the problem, the audience would it would be easier for the audience to realize the issues at stake, and they are more likely to listen on. Okay, so that's the APT structure introducing this research. Right? Now, that's the end part. Right? Now, the core of the message, the problem part, the but part. In this part, you should identify the problem. You will try to answer this question, what is the problem? You should, whenever you try to construct a message, you should think about, answer the question, what the problem is. Right? You have to identify a problem in order to convey a message that other people will find interesting. If there's no problem, no one would get interested. Right? So verbalizing a problem is the quickest way to simplicity. To help you identify the center of a narrative, you can use this nothing except structure that help you to identify what is at the stake, what is the most important problem that you can try to solve. Right? So here are some examples. The center of your narrative. What is the one factor that explains and embraces all about your themes? So that is the narrative. So think about this one factor, right? After you determine a topic, you will try to identify the problem. You can find the one factor that can explain and embrace all your themes. Like for example, if you want to highlight evolution, highlight something, discuss something in biology, you can use this sentence. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. That highlights the importance of evolution. If you're talking about evolution, that could attract the attention of the audience. Nothing in geology makes sense except in the light of plate tectonics. Nothing in trade theory makes sense except in the light of comparative advantage. And nothing at Apple computers makes sense except in the light of innovation. So all these things could help you to identify the core topics that you want to discuss. Right? So that is the center of your narrative, of your structure. So as we mentioned, but is the word of contradiction in this APT structure. Contradiction breaks the momentum and activates the brain. Okay, it gets the interest of the audience because it activates their brain. But also at the same time, people exhibit the need for closure. The need for closure, it's a concept in psychology, is just a desire for a firm answer to a question and an aversion towards ambiguity, right? So that means if you just present a problem without offering a solution, the need for closure would make this audience very anxious because you are offering a problem. Is there a problem? It seems very ambiguous, very uncertain, so they will not develop the sense of satisfaction from your message. In order to develop the sense of satisfaction, you should offer a solution. And that's the main objective of their therefore part. Therefore, offer a solution and suggest the action to take. Okay, so that's just very brief discussion of the ABT structure, right? So it should be quite straightforward and quite easy to start, right? So just, set the context. Whenever you present a message, first set the context, point out the problem, and then point to the potential solution that could solve this problem, right? So these could highlight the motivation of your message, right? So now, to prove the effectiveness of the ABT structure, let me give you some examples. So first, if you look at the movie industry, the entertainment industry, including the movies and TV shows, and also the great fictions novels, all those great stories, they follow this ABT structure, right? So the ABT structure was first formalized and popularized actually in the entertainment world by Hollywood screenwriters, right? So all the screens, I mean, all the screenwriters, if you go to college to study screenwriting, I mean, that's the thing you are trained upon, right? So you should be quite fluent in using this ABT structure to write stories, right? And as we have said, this ABT structure is not only useful for writing stories, it's also useful for constructing any message. So now let us look at some speeches, messages in history demonstrating the prevalence of ABT structure. If you look at all the great speeches that you can find in history, I mean, they more or less follow this ABT structure, right? So here is the example of Gettysburg's address by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War of the United States. Right. So if you look at the structure, you basically see this ABT. Right. So to summarize this main message, you can see that Lincoln was saying that we are a great and mighty nation as the American, but that's the problem. But now we are engaged in a horrible civil war that we cannot allow to destroy this country. Therefore, we offering a solution, call for action. It is up to us, the living, to be dedicated to the unfinished work so that the souls lost in the battle did not die in vain. So it call for action, right? And we should fight and dedicate it to win the war so that we will remain as a great and mighty nation. Right? So that's the solution to the problem pointed out here. And here is the full speech. Gettysburg speech, right? So here you see that Lincoln first set up the context. 407 years ago, our father brought forth on this continent a new nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. So that is a fact that everyone can accept, especially among the Americans, right? It's a great establishment as the United States of America, and that prove that we are a great nation, right? Now, a problem. We are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield on that war, right? So this is the problem we are having now. And then our solution. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who have gave their lives that the nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this, right? So here, we are in a war. That's the problem. And people died for that. So one solution for those who have passed away, we have dedicated a portion of that field to memorize them, right? And you can see that later we see another bot structure. You see that this ABT structure can be parallel. You don't have to only have one ABT. You could have A setting the context, and then one problem solution, another problem solution. So there are different ways, different variations in applying this ABT structure. And here is point out another problem, but in a large sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it will never forget what they did here, right? So here is the problem again. So then call for action. It is therefore for us living to do this, to do that, so that the government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth, right? So this is a great illustration of the APD structure. Now, another important speech back in the Americans' history is Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech, right? So I guess most of you at least heard of it. I mean, back in China, I mean, all of us have read this, and I remember when I was in high school, my English teacher even asked us to memorize this. So if you look at the structure of Martin Luther King's speech is also closely follow this APG structure, right? So to summarize, as an APG structure we see here, we were made a promise a century ago, and that century ago was actually a promise made by Abraham Lincoln, right? So we will have a nation to liberalize the African American people, right? And we've made some progress. So this is something that people can agree upon, right? Especially among the African American who are the major audience to this speech. But the journey is nowhere near completed. We have still experienced a lot of issues. I mean, that's actually why people are gathering there, right? So if you don't know, you can check the background. It's mainly because the discrimination against the black. The lady who get on the bus and they refuse her to sit on a certain seat. I mean, then she got deducted detained by the policeman, and then it's all the African American got furious about this. I mean, that leads to this civil rights movement, right? And so that's why King says here the journey is nowhere near complete. Therefore, call for action, call for solution. We are gathered here today on the Washington Mall to dramatize a shameful condition and continue this mission, right? So if you there's an interesting fact. If you compare Martin Luther King's speech with the Abraham Lincoln speech, there's a lot of similarity. It's not just the structure, but also the usage of the words, right? So here you see King's started with 5 score years ago. I mean, that's a very formal way to say 100 years ago, right? So if you look at how Abraham Lincoln described 87 years ago, he says 4 score and 7 years ago, right? So it seems like a king tried to mimic the style of Abraham Lincoln. Instead of saying 100 years ago, he used 5 score years ago, right? And now, in any event, so here is the background. 5 score years ago, a great American who in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. This momentous decree came as a great beacon light of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been seared in the flames of withering injustice. It came as a joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity, right? So this highlights this great promise that established by the Emancipation Proclamation, established by President Abraham Lincoln. That set the context, right? So it's a great promise. But 100 years later, the Negro still is not free. 100 years later, the life of the Negro is still sadly crippled by the manacles of segregation and the chains of discrimination. 100 years later, the Negroes live on a lonely land of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity, so on and so forth. Right? So here are the problem, and you have to solve. And then, therefore, so we've come here today to dramatize a shameful condition, so that call for our collective action. Okay, so this is the APT structure. And of course, something that make those speeches memorable and lasting throughout the history is not only the ABT structure. We see they use a lot of rhetorics, like Abraham Lincoln used this 100 years later, 100 years later. It's a parallel sentence that make it very rhythmic and easy to remember. So we mentioned that when like the sentence rhyme, it's easier for system one to process and make system one easier to believe it's true. And when you have this parallel structure, it's also have this rhythmic beat, and your system will also tend to believe that is true and it should have some wisdom within it, right? So there are some other things related to rhetoric to make this speech very powerful. But I mean, the commonality of all those those great speeches is actually also the structure, right? So we have this ABD structure that make it easy for the audience to follow, right? So set up the context everyone agrees, and the problem excite people and arouse people's interest, and then offer the solution. Okay, so these are the two examples back in history how this AP structure make the speech, the message clear and more powerful and convincing. Right? Now, so if we move our focus from the speeches and to something in the popular culture, uh, you will observe this ABT structure throughout also. Like, every student probably know that I have a 3-year-old, and I start to sing to her and starting to listen to some of the kids songs, including the nursery rhymes. And if you check a lot of the songs that the kids sing, and including the nursery rhymes, it also follow this ABT structure, right? So, for example, this very common nursery rhyme. Mary had a little lamb, right? So it followed the A-B structure. First, it said the background, Mary had a little lamb, and describing the lamb, and also describe the context, everyone, the every day the lamb would follow Mary, right? And then the problem came. It followed her to school one day, but that is against the rule. So here, follow her to school one day and against the rules. This is the problem, right? And this problem would actually again arouse the kids' interest, right? So they would think about the plot of the story. Mary had a little lamb is a common, ordinary most of the time, and then one day it followed through follow her to school and against the rule. And because it's against the rule, the other kids start to laugh, and then that's the consequences. Right? So this is the AB structure. Because there is a problem, the kids are more interested in singing the song because it's more it would have some emotional appeal, right? And then here is one song called Call Me Maybe. I mean, this is a very old song. I mean, it was quite popular when I studied for my PhD. It's more than a decade ago, like maybe already 15 years ago. I don't know how many of you still know the song. It was quite popular, but it's a funny song. If you watch the MV, and you will see that there's a twist in the plot. But let's just focus on the lyrics. If you look at the lyrics, you will also discover this ABD structure. Right? So here, this lady is saying that, hey, I just met you and this is crazy. So this is the context. I met you and this what I'm going to do may be crazy, but here's my number, right? So here's the problem, right? I mean, this is awkward, but it seems like I'm having a crush on you. I mean, it's awkward, but I want to take the initiative. So I give you this number, call me maybe. So call for action. And then here's hard to look at right at your baby, setting the context. But again, here's I'm willing to take the initiative, right? With this tension, but give you this number. So call for your action. Call me maybe, right? So this is again illustration of ABT structure, right? Now you might be wondering, we have a lot of examples of using ABT structure. Is there any proof that the ABT structure is working? Is actually and really more persuasive compared to other structure? Well, there's no formal study, but there's a scientist and then switched to as a director in Hollywood called Randy Olson. He actually proposed and popularized this A-bit structure. He actually conducted some preliminary research. He actually gathered all the message, all kinds of message together and try to uh, measure how APT structures in different messages, right? And here is the result presented by Olsen, right? So as we have discussed, AAA structure causes boring messages, and the use of APT structure can be more effective, right? So, but how can we measure that? Olsen actually come up with this measure. He basically just measured the number of the word but or however that represent highlighting of the problem, okay, representing turning point in this message, and then count the number of ends, calculate the ratio. Right? So here is an illustration. And he called this narrative index. It's basically the number of buts divided by the number of ends. If this narrative index is closing to 100, that means for each end, there is a but, right? For each context that is set, you pointed a problem with a turning point. So this is a rough measure. It's not that scientific, but it's a rough measure to demonstrate the effectiveness of the ABD structure. So here are different sources of message. So we have maintenance manual. So that's the instruction manual. You know that no one would enjoy no regular people would enjoy reading maintenance manual because it's something that you read when you have a problem to solve, right? So you have a new appliance that you want to use, a fridge that you don't know how to use, you just find the corresponding information and you don't read it for fun. And then we have the speeches by different people, right? So we have Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I mean, these are two quite important comparison. So these are actually speeches from their presidential debate back from 2016. And then we have Abraham Lincoln's speech and Stephen Douglas. Most of you probably would not know who he is. He actually ran for president competing with Abraham Lincoln. Right? And then we have Bill Maher. If you know, he is actually a talk show comedian, right? So he just he knows, right, in his talk show how to make a message more interesting, right? As we can see here, we have different narrative index. Although it's a rough measure, but we can see this narrative index actually is a good measure of how interesting the corresponding message is, right? If we compare this usage of narrative index between different presidential candidates, I mean, it seems that we can even predict who is likely to convince the voters and to win the presidency, right? So here we see Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. In terms of narrative index, Donald Trump is much more interesting, much more persuasive. And comparing Abraham Lincoln and his running mate in this presidential election, Stephen Douglas, Abraham Lincoln is also much more persuasive in measured by ABD structure, right? So here is some detailed illustration, right? So here is the comparison between Lincoln and Douglas. And we have 7 presidential debates. And see, throughout the debate, Lincoln was more persuasive in terms of the measure of narrative index, right? So here is actually some of the highlights, the counts of the words, demonstrating how this narrative index is calculated. So, I mean, this is a good predictor, right? So this measure can be used for all the past presidential election. For most of the presidential election, the narrative index can perfectly predict who won the corresponding presidential election. But there was one exception, right? And it was actually a huge exception. Here, if we compare these two candidates, Richard Nixon and John F. Kennedy, right? And if we look at the corresponding narrative index, we will predict that Nixon would be slightly more persuasive compared to Kennedy. But if you knew from history, I mean, Kennedy actually won the election and became the president, even though Nixon actually run for presidency again and later became president again. But during this presidential campaign, presidential competition debate, Nixon actually lost. But why? You may be wondering, right? So why this narrative index did not work for this time? I mean, first, it proved that the persuasiveness of the message is not the only thing that determines your influence. There are other factors. So back to this case, I can give you some background information. This time, it was the first time this presidential debate was broadcast live on television. Before then, it was only held on video. Okay, I mean, before this presidential debate, people can only hear the debate through video, but that was the first time they go on TV. And if you watch this TV, this debate, Nixon seems very fitted, and he tried to appear very manly. He actually refused to put on makeups, and so that's why you can see that her face, his face appears very dark and appears at the light appears very pale, right? Seems very nervous when he speaks, and he also the room was warm, if I remember, and he actually has a lot of sweat on her face, on his face. So that make this body language convey a quite mixed message, even though his message is more persuasive, but his body language is conveying that he's a bit nervous, right? So Kennedy actually was a star, a movie star who actually played some movies. He knew very well how to control his body language, so he appears very confident, right? So here it seems that body language is also quite important. That's the conveying of the message, right? It's not just the structure. It's back to this idea of pathos, right? So looking at these two candidates on TV, Kennedy seems more trustworthy. So that's why Kennedy eventually won this presidency, right? So here is another interesting observation. The voters were actually asked which presidential candidate they think is more persuasive or performs better than the other. Those viewers of TV debate, they almost universally think Kennedy did better. But for those who listen to this debate on radio, I mean, most of them actually think Nixon was better, right? So that's how this persuasive message, if you just look at the persuasiveness, Nixon definitely outperformed Kennedy. But if you look at the TV delivery, I mean, the delivery is also important. Body language is important, right? So this is telling us that ABT structure is one thing that improves the persuasiveness of your message, but it's so if you are having a live presentation to your audience, the body language, how you deliver the message is also quite important, right? Now, so that's the analysis of presidential debate, demonstrating that the ABT structure actually work quite well, right? Although it's not the only determinant of persuasiveness, delivery, right? Body language, how you express yourself, also important. Right? Now, here is another quite interesting neuroscience study that demonstrate the reaction of the audience when they watch different types of videos. Right? So on the left is the firing in the brain when the audience watch some videos of reality, just this truthful documentation of what is going on Washington Square Park, right? So it's just nothing special. You just hang a camera there, just document everything. Right? So here is a non-narrative documentation of what is going on. Right? As you can see here, not a lot of area in the brain got activated. However, if you look at the brain scan of the viewers of a movie, here is a suspense movie directed by Hitchcock, and you will see there are a lot of activation. So that means that when you look at something that have this narrative structure that are exciting, then you will have more firing in the brain. I mean, this firing in the brain represent your interest towards the corresponding message. Now, talking about the ABD structure, one last thing I want to discuss is its relation to some of the design principles. So here is a famous designer, Raymond Loewy. Loewy actually designed a lot of famous products. Now you can steal some of them, right? Like the logo of Shell and the BP, and also this very classic glass bottle of Coca-Cola were all designed by him. Right? He has this very simple and straightforward design principle. He says that liking is familiarity plus surprise. Okay? And he actually has this so-called Maya principle. You should make your design most advanced yet acceptable. Why I'm talking about this? Because it still have some similarity with the ABT structure. Recall that the ABT structure, we emphasize that you need to set the context that should set your message acceptable by your audience, right? Acceptability, or say the A part in the ABT structure, represent familiarity. You should make this message familiar, right? Back to, talking about in terms of a Maya principle, you need to make the message acceptable. And then you should come as a surprise in order to drag the attention of the audience. In the design principle, you should be advanced, right? If everything is in your design is expected by the consumer, I mean, they will find it boring. Similarly, if everything is expected in your message, they will find it boring. You have to come up with some surprise to grab the attention, the interest of the corresponding audience. That's where this but part, the identification of problem, would play, right? So that's where it can generate the surprise and grab the attention of the audience. Okay. Now that's the discussion behind the principle of ABD structure. Now, we will spend some time to look at some examples, how to restructure some of the messages to the ABD structure to make it more persuasive or easier to follow, right? So here is one example. In a lot of the associations, they will need to write mission statement, right? So for some of the companies, they will also write their mission statement, even though it's not that common in the for-profit companies, but in non-governmental organization, non-profit enterprise, I mean, they will. It's very likely for them to write this mission statement. But if you look at some of the mission statement, I mean, it's difficult for them to leave any memory towards the readers, right? Why? Well, because the structure, right? So the information there, of course, is important. Is reflect what the corresponding association and agency or organizations try to do. But if you don't structure the message well, the readers may not be able to get the main message to pay attention to where you want them to pay attention to, right? So here is just one example, right? So mission statement. So here it says our mission is to transform society's response to sexual assaults, domestic violence, and child abuse, supporting survivors' healing, and end this violence forever. Right? So you point out the mission. And then, well, we understand that our mission may not be achievable in our lifetime. We firmly believe that violence and abuse are preventable. And then in support of our vision and mission, we have developed blah blah. Here's what we should our value. Here are our guiding principles. So if you read this, I mean, there are important informations, but it's difficult for the readers to focus on any piece of information. I mean, you read, you think that, okay, this is a good mission. But after reading this, you don't remember many of the aspects mentioned here, right? So why why is this the case and what is the issue? Well, the main issue is that it does not point out any problems yet. Right? It says that we are trying to transform the society, we try to reduce sexual adult, but what are the problem? If you do not point out the problem or the seriousness of the problem, why people should care? Right? So that's why here I highlight this ABT, this end part as blue, this therefore part would call for actions as green, right? So you see here, there's no problem pointed out. Now think about how to restructure this message using the ABT structure so that people would be more willing to read on and to remember this message. Here is one way of reframing and restructure the message, right? So here's as first setting the background and point out the problem. Domestic violence touches everyone's lives in America, right? So this is something that almost everyone can accept, and also point out some statistics, some facts that everyone cannot refuse. More than 1.7 million workdays are lost each year because of it, and programs do exist to combat it. Right? So that's the background. Here it point out the seriousness, but current effort are not enough. Right? So here, some part of the background are actually part also the bad part, the problem. But here, in order to highlight this, I mean, I only highlight the sentence after the but, right? So here, now we have the clear ABD structure. Set the background and point out the problem. Now, after the problem is clearly presented, the readers now care a lot more to read on. Society's overall response need to be transformed, and then we are doing this to achieve this goal, to solve this problem. Right? So that's how this miraculous effect caused by the restructuring of the message from this boring AAA structure to ABT structure. Here is another mission statement. It's this media watchdog group. So if we look at and categorize these different functions of the message, we see that it first lay out the background, the context, and then it just mentions what they do, right? Again, the issue with this mission statement is that it does not point to any problem, right? So launched in May 2004, Media Matters for America put in place for the first time the means to systematically monitor cross-sectional print, broadcast, cable, radio, and internet media outlets for conservative misinformation, news for commentary that is not accurate, reliable, or credible, and that forwards the conservative agenda every day in real time. I mean, this is a good layout of the context, right? And then our brains or the audience brains will start to look for some questions. Do you have any questions to give you after giving the background? Well, the statement did not point out to any questions. It's instead saying that what they do. Use the website MediaMatters.org as the principal vehicle for disseminating research and information. Media Matters post rapid response item as well as longer research and analytical reports documenting conservative misinformation throughout the medium, right? So it seems that they are doing something interesting, but why are they doing this? We don't know. I mean, the major goal of mission statement should be that you point out the problem, and then we, as an organization or as an association, want to solve or try to solve those questions. But no questions is mentioned in this mission statement. So that's why it's not qualified as a mission statement or not even qualified as a persuasive message. So here is the rewritten of the message. Right? By 2004, conservative media has established an overall overwhelming presence across print, broadcast, cable, radio, and internet. Right? So that's a simple setting of the context. Now the problem, right? You need to point out the problem to get the interest of the audience. But there was no organization able to systematically monitor them for news or commentary that is not accurate, reliable, or credible. Okay, now you sense what the problem is, right? Basically, there's a problem of probably in misinformation or fake news. Nobody has been looking at. Okay, that's a serious problem. Now you realize the seriousness of the problem, right? And then Media Matters for America was created to meet this need every day in real time and blah blah. Here's what we do. And now you are interested in continuing reading on. Okay. Again, the problem should be the core of your message. Without the problem, I mean, there's no point in having that message, right? So the goal of a message usually is to solve some problem. I mean, especially for the persuasive message, right? Now, here is one um, summary of a research article. So it's maybe too technical. So in case you are interested, you can read on your own. So I will just skip this example. But here is a grant proposal, right? So you know if in case you continue uh, to study for a master's and a PhD degree and start to become a researcher, one major task in your life, in your academic life, in your work, is just to write grant proposals, right? And looking at the grant proposal is also a persuasive message. It should be a message to persuade the potential reviewers that you are doing some research that is important. And again, it's important for your grant proposal to write in the ABT structure. Right? And similarly, if even if you work in a company industry, sometimes you need to request for some resources. It would be the same idea. You need to point out the problem, set the setting that your boss would accept, right? And a background that your boss would agree, would have no objection consistent with their belief, and then point out the problem, right? And the resources that you ask for should be used to solve some problems, right? So that's why the core of the message should be the problem, and then therefore how pointed out how why you should give me the resources and how this resource could help to solve this problem, right? So that's the general structure. Any message, right, you can think of could adopt this APT structure, right? So now let's just look at this example of research grant application, right? So here is the original version where the applicant Jorn Carling, I mean, he wrote uh, a report summarizing how to be successful in this specific grant application, right? And here he presented the original version of the application, and we'll see it is not that clear, right? So here is that the project aim to refine and advance key components in migration theory, our comprehension of how people think and feel about geographic mobility, right? So here is already the therefore part, what I do part, even without setting the background or pointing out the problem. And to denote such thoughts and feelings, the project introduced the construct mental disposition towards motility. This is a critical component in analysis that see migration as the outcome of two sequential processes. First, evaluating the scenario migration, then converting the conclusion into action. So I'm totally confused by reading this. I mean, if you try very hard, the information is there, you can understand what the author is trying to do. But everything discussed here is what he does or he planned to do. Right? It does not point out the setting, the context, what the problem is situated in, and what is the problem. So that's why it's very difficult for the readers to understand the importance of the problem, right? So I always talk to my PhD students, and also when I supervise my master's student, one of the most important thing in writing a thesis, your master thesis or PhD thesis, is to motivate the research question well, right? So you have to set the setting and then point out the problem, why it is important to investigate this problem, right? So that's the so-called ABT structure. I mean, this grant proposal, this start of the grant proposal, does not use the ABT structure and it does not point to any problem, let alone motivating the problem, the motivating why solving that problem is important, right? And also there are too many complex elements to digest without one core narrative. So it's difficult to imagine the product as an important mission. Now, here is the revision. I mean, this time after the revision, the applicant, the author successfully get the grant. And you see it has a clear ABD structure. The springboard for this product is a striking statistic. It now is set a fact, right? Half of all young people in West Africa wish to leave their own country and settle everywhere, right? So it's a surprising fact. I mean, also interesting. Now, the author might be wondering, what are the implications of this setting? Now, the problem is there, yet the vast majority never departed. So now it's present a puzzle. Half of the young people want to leave their own country, but a majority of those half, they never leave, they never depart. So this discrepancy raises a fundamental question. If migration is desired but never been materialized, what are the consequences? And now the problem is there. Now everything else would follow, right? So now you are ready to present what you plan to do and the details. So the project breaks with traditional approaches by shifting the object of study from observed migration in the present to imagined migration in the future. So now everything is clear. That's how using the ABD structure can miraculously change the conveying of your message to make it easier to follow and also make people to understand why it is important, right? Now, that's the examples. So we are coming to a conclusion to our discussion of the ABD structure. Before we end, I want to answer the following question. You might be wondering, I know ABD structure is very powerful, but do I have to follow the ABD structure? Well, it has been demonstrated that the ABD structure is effective, but if you look at a lot of the messages or all the message, not all the effective message follow the ABD structure. And sometimes, like for a grant proposal or for a research article, they pointed out the solution, pointed out what I'm doing, and then set the background and point out the problem. Right? So it can be like a TAB, right, or TBA. But the most natural structure is ABT. So I mean, it's maybe best to set the background first and then point out the problem and point out what is supposed to be done to solve this problem, right? So my suggestion to you is that you should try to practice this structure to develop your narrative intuition. First, grasp the rule, right? After you master the structure, then you can feel free to break it, right? So if you know the importance of each part and how to present each part, I mean, later, after you have mastered the structure, you can rearrange it. It's not a problem. Okay, but it is dangerous before grasping the structure and try to experimenting. But one, based on my experience and the experience of a lot of students, after you have grasped the ABD structure, more than likely that you will be able to apply the structure without noticing it, right? So you will more than likely to abide by, to follow this ABD structure, right? So so to answer this question in a word, you don't have to follow this ABD structure, but you are strongly suggested to apply this structure until you have mastered it, understand why you are doing this. Then I mean, it may become intuition, right? So you may, go beyond the ABD structure, but you should start with following this ABD structure. Now, to conclude the ABD structure, I give some general advice for writing. You should, when you try to write, it's better to use verbs and nouns. Minimize the use of adjectives, right? Because adjectives, I mean, they are not effective, right? They could be effective if you can flesh them out and explain exactly why you have selected them. Otherwise, they are just meaningless and somewhat annoying. So here is one example. The program is really innovative, right? So that's an adjective describing your program. But it's just one adjective, and people would wonder why you think is innovative, right? So you could use adjective, but only if you can flash it out with what the evidence why it is indeed innovative. Here, another way of saying that the innovative program is among the earliest in the city of Metropolis to pair college student and preschool children for basketball lessons, right? So when you flash out why this is innovative, because it's among the first, right? So it's the first that's make it innovative. I mean, that's when you could use adjective. Otherwise, verbs and nouns are better, right? And also, if you are able to use concrete concept, is better than using abstract concept, as we will discuss later in our part 3 for today's lecture, persuasion examples. Okay. So now, before we start the following 20 minutes or so, presenting some examples, any questions related to the ABT structure? Okay, if no questions, we can go to some quite powerful persuasion tactics. The first tactics I want to introduce is high ground maneuver. So when you face a criticism, you can take the argument up to a level where you can say something that is absolutely true while changing the context at the same time. Right? After this, the other participant will fear, or the criticizers will fear appearing small-minded if they drag and the argument back to the detail level, right? So here is just one example. It's not the perfect example, but it's just one way to minimize the effect of criticism. So if a military drone accidentally kills civilians, and there is a public outcry, it would be a mistake for the military to spend too much time talking about what went wrong in that particular situation, particular mission, right? So if you talk too much time talking about what went wrong, people's focus would be on the mistakes that you have been made, right? So that's like the availability heuristic. The more you think about something, I mean, that thing would seem more important, right? People would think those mistakes are unforgivable and those mistakes are quite serious, right? So instead of talking about what went wrong, talking about the mistakes, what you could do is to bring this argument to a higher level, right? You can say that war is messy. No one wants civilians to die. Okay, so this is something that everyone can accept, similar to this ABT structure, right? So it set the background that everyone can apply. And it's important that this new context is actually to a higher level compared to the detailed argument, detailed criticism that you receive, right? So after you say that war is messy, no one wants civilian to die, we will study this situation to see how we can better avoid it in the future, right? Of course, this is not a foolproof tactic that you can prevent any negative effect of the criticism, but it's probably the most effective way, right? It minimize the negative effect of criticism. So Steve Jobs is a master persuader, right? So you can see we have a couple of examples, this one and the next. So this is the example how he has used this high ground maneuver to like turn criticism into the promotion of their company's mission idea, right? So, decades ago when iPhone 4 was out, there was a serious iPhone reception issue, right? And if you have some other CEOs, they might discuss how to solve the issue, why the issue arose. But Steve Jobs know that's not the way to solve the problem or to minimize the negative effect. So here is what he said. He said, we are not perfect. Phones are not perfect. I mean, that's some statement that you cannot refute. Right? And also it bring it to a higher background. We all know that, but we want to make our users happy. Right? So now, after you have make this argument to a higher level, it's difficult for the criticizers to still focus on the small issues, right? Of course, it's not saying that you should not solve the issue. It's important to solve the issue. And actually later, Jobs actually presented the solutions to solve this issue immediately. But once you have, changed the focus of the users, right? From there are faulty iPhones to that we are a company to try our best to make our user happy. I mean, actually shift the user's focus to the mission of or the value of the company, right? And used well, this high ground maneuver can turn criticism into persuasion. So here is another example from Steve Jobs. Uh, so this was back in 1997 in this worldwide developer conferences, and he received this very serious criticism from this young man. So let's just take a look at this and consider how he turned in the criticism into persuasion. Right?
Yes.
Mr. Jobs, you're a bright and influential man.
Here it comes.
It's sad and clear that on several counts you've discussed, you don't know what you're talking about. I would like, for example, for you to express in clear terms how, say, Java, in any of its incarnations, addresses the ideas embodied in OpenDoc. And when you're finished with that, perhaps you could tell us what you personally have been doing for the last 7 years.
You know, you can please some of the people some of the time, but one of the hardest things when you're trying to affect change is that people like this gentleman are right in some areas. I'm sure that there are some things OpenDoc does, probably even more that I'm not familiar with, that nothing else out there does. And I'm sure that you can make some demos, maybe a small commercial app that demonstrates those things. The hardest thing is, how does that fit in to a cohesive, larger vision that's going to allow you to sell $8 billion, $10 billion of product a year? And one of the things I've always found is that you've got to start with the customer experience and work backwards to the technology. You can't start with the technology and try to figure out where you're going to try to sell it. And I've made this mistake probably more than anybody else in this room. And I've got the scar tissue to prove it. And I know that it's the case. And as we have tried to come up with a strategy and a vision for Apple, it started with what incredible benefits can we give to the customer? Where can we take the customer? Not starting with, let's sit down with the engineers and figure out what awesome technology we have, and then how are we going to market that. And I think that's the right path to take. I remember with the laser writer, we built the world's first small laser printers, you know. And there was awesome technology in that box. We had the first Canon laser printing, cheap laser printing engine in the world, in the United States here at Apple. We had a very wonderful printer controller that we designed. We had Adobe's PostScript software in there. We had AppleTalk in there. Just awesome technology in the box. And I remember seeing the first printout come out of it and just picking it up and looking at it and thinking, you know, we can sell this. Because you don't have to know anything about what's in that box. All we have to do is hold this up and go, do you want this? And if you can remember back to 1984, before laser printers, it was pretty startling to see that. People went, whoa, yes. And that's where Apple's got to get back to. And, you know, I'm sorry that OpenDoc's a casualty along the way. And I readily admit there are many things in life that I don't have the faintest idea what I'm talking about. So I apologize for that too. But there's a whole lot of people working super, super hard right now at Apple. You know, Avi, John, Garino, Fred, I mean, the whole team is working, burning the midnight oil, trying to, and people, you know, hundreds of people below them, to execute on some of these things, and they're doing their best. And I think that what we need to do, and some mistakes will be made, by the way. Some mistakes will be made along the way. That's good, because at least some decisions are being made along the way. And we'll find the mistakes, we'll fix them. And I think what we need to do is support that team going through this very important stage as they work their butts off. They're all getting calls, being offered 3 times as much money to go do this, do that. The valley's hot. None of them are leaving. And I think we need to support them and see them through this and write some damn good applications to support Apple out in the market. That's my own point of view. Mistakes will be made. Some people will be pissed off. Some people will not know what they're talking about. But I think it is so much better than where things were not very long ago. And I think we're going to get there.
Okay, so that's a great example demonstrating how to turn criticism into persuasion, right? So here, one thing that I want to pay attention to is that when in a situation like this, right, when you try to persuade, what you are trying to do is not to change the opinion. Your major goal is not to change the opinion of your criticizer. You are trying to change or exert influence among the other audience. Okay, so here we have the young gentleman has this a biased opinion towards Steve Jobs and what he did, and he might not be changing his idea after Steve Jobs has this wonderful speech about the focus of Apple and the focus of how to use technology to change the world and to make their customer happy, right? So the focus should be, try to convince or persuade your audience, right? So the third party. So look at this serious criticism. It is said that clearly on several accounts you've discussed, you have no idea what you're talking about, right? Now, once you know that your goal is to convince the third party, now it's natural that you should not take a negative view or have negative comments towards the criticizer. Instead, I mean, you can agree with the criticizer, like what Jobs did. This gentleman is exactly correct. Sometimes we are just too technology driven, and we don't think about the usage, the needs of the customers. And so by turning this criticism into a different topic, I mean, you see that Jobs never answer some of the questions, right? He just focus on what he want to express, right? He want to talk about the focus of Apple and talk about how Apple's product revolutionize the world, right? So that's how you use high ground maneuver, right? And then we come to another example. I mean, this is an example from someone that not a lot of you like, Donald Trump. I mean, believe it or not, or trust it or not, accept it or not, Trump is actually a very effective influencer and persuader. Right? So here is just one example, and later we'll have another example demonstrating how Trump has used this high ground maneuver to actually exert this huge influence towards the audience. Right? So I mean, here is a debate or between Kelly, I think it was Megan Kelly. Megan Kelly actually again asked a very tricky question, right, to demonstrate the criticism of a lot of people towards Donald Trump. And Donald Trump actually has used this opportunity to turn this criticism in some opportunity to convince and influence his supporters, right? And here is just one comment from Kelly. You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. So the first response from Trump is that he said only Rosie O'Donnell's, right? So I mean here, to some of you who don't know the background, Rosie O'Donnell is someone that the Republicans or say the Trump supporters who are really not fond of, right? They hate Rosie O'Donnell. because O'Donnell is a very liberal that is very against the views of many of the Republicans. So, and let's just go through this video to see how Donald Trump has used this high ground maneuver to turn this criticism into an opportunity of persuasion. It's just a 2-minute long video.
One of the things people love about you is you speak your mind and you don't use a politician's filter. However, that is not without its downsides, in particular when it comes to women. You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account...
Only Rosie O'Donnell.
No, it wasn't.
Okay, I want to stop here because you see the cheering from the audience because Trump knows the preference, the values of their audience, right? So he said only Rosie O'Donnell's, and then because all the audience don't have a good feeling towards Rosie O'Donnell, that's why they cheers, right? And then another thing that I want to mention is that you see Kelly is a very professional journalist. You see that when journalists, when they are professional, they start to question the interviewee. They actually also say something that complimenting the other person, right? So it's like an ABD structure. First say something before pointing out the problem. First say something that can build agreement, right? So maybe let's just watch the start part. If you recall the criticism by the young gentleman, I mean, he also, even though it's a sarcastic way of using it, he even started with this first comments, right? So you're a smart man, and then pointed out the problem, right? So that's one technique you could use. Let's review this first part from Kelly.
Mr. Trump, one of the things people love about you is you speak your mind and you don't use a politician's filter.
That's compliment, right? That's ABD structure, the A part, right? Building agreement, and then the problem, however.
However, that is not without its downsides, in particular when it comes to women. You've called women you don't like fat pigs, dogs, slobs, and disgusting animals. Your Twitter account...
Only Rosie O'Donnell.
No, it wasn't. Your Twitter account...
Thank you.
For the record, it was well beyond Rosie O'Donnell.
Yes, I'm sure it was.
Your Twitter account has...
Again, I'm also sorry for stopping again. And focus on the fact that, as I mentioned, the goal when you're talking to your criticizer, when they are third parties, your goal is especially Trump's goal is to convince or to influence the third party audience, right? So that's why there's no point in trying to argue with your criticizer, because that actually wastes your opportunity of influencing, right? So here is that Trump never said that I didn't say that, or say that you said something worse, right? Instead, he said, I'm sure. When Kelly said, I'm sure it was beyond Rosie O'Donnell, and Trump actually agreed, saying the word that I'm sure it was, right? So it's not disagreeing or even arguing with your criticizer. I mean, it's a bad way because it's of communicating, because it loses the opportunity of influencing the audience.
Several disparaging comments about women's looks. You once told a contestant on Celebrity Apprentice it would be a pretty picture to see her on her knees. Does that sound to you like the temperament of a man we should elect as president? And how will you answer the charge from Hillary Clinton, who is likely to be the Democratic nominee, that you are part of the war on women?
I think the big problem this country has is being politically correct. I've been challenged by so many people, and I don't frankly have time for total political correctness. And to be honest with you, this country doesn't have time either. This country is in big trouble. We don't win anymore. We lose to China. We lose to Mexico, both in trade and at the border. We lose to everybody. And frankly, what I say, and oftentimes it's fun, it's kidding, we have a good time, what I say is what I say. And honestly, Megan, if you don't like it, I'm sorry. I've been very nice to you, although I could probably maybe not be based on the way you have treated me, but I wouldn't do that. But you know what? We need strength, we need energy, we need quickness, and we need brain in this country to turn it around. That I can tell you right now.
All right, so that's the great example of high ground maneuver, right? So as we mentioned, this, if used well, you can turn criticism into persuasion. I mean, the way Trump used this high ground maneuver can also be summarized as pacing and leading. So you first match your audience emotional condition, like that's why he actually mentioned Rosie O'Donnell, right? And then after matching the audience emotional condition, you're gaining the trust from them, and then you are in the position to lead them, right? So that's how high ground maneuver can turn a criticism into opportunities of influencing other people, right? And when we talk about persuasion, it's actually quite important to talk to people's emotion, the emotional appeal, something that we have talked about throughout the course. We talk about emotion is the integral part for decision making, and it's the integral part of influencing other people. And also is a one important component for the modes of persuasion, right? So language is an important tool for persuasion and influence. And you can see that stories, metaphors, images, they are much more persuasive than facts and statistics because stories, metaphors, images are easy for a system one to process and they can directly speak to people's emotion. And so that's why a lesson we could learn from this is that your language should create vivid information and strong information and strong emotion, right? So when you talk about statistics, for example, try to create an image that's much better than just talking about numbers. And also, if you are able to create strong emotions, that would be make your message more effective. People will not remember the facts and statistics, but they will remember the emotion, right? So here is a quote by Joseph Campbell, the great mythologist who writes the hero's journey. He said, if you want to change the world, change the metaphor, change the story, change the emotional response that you can arouse from your readers, from your audience. To demonstrate the power of the numbers and statistics, let me give you one example. So in this study, people or in the survey were asked how much they're willing to pay to save 2,000 birds, 20,000 birds, and 200,000 of birds. Right? Participants were completely ignorant about the number. So as it turns out, if you see the average number, average money they are willing to contribute, I mean, even though the third number is 100 times more than the first number, I mean, the average amount, there's no significant difference. They are almost the same. However, if you are able to show an image or tell a story, it would be much more effective. So if you are able to show one image like this, right, instead of showing the numbers, you can just simply ignore the numbers. But I would suggest that having some statistic would be make your information much more trustworthy. But adding this number that can arouse people's emotion, that would make your elicitation more effective. Right? So here's another example. Eliciting donation to one girl named Rokia in Africa is more effective than donations to 1,000 girls. Right? So demonstrating the powerless of numbers and statistics. People are more likely to donate to a single needy individual than to an entire impoverished region, right? So like the example of Rokia. And we are wired to feel things for individuals, not for statistics or abstraction. Many people know this fact. Like Mother Teresa has mentioned that if I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one, I will. Joseph Stalin even says The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic. Because when the number is large enough, we lose our sense. We lose our sensitiveness to those numbers. So that's why emotional appeal is much more stronger.